All right. What do you think? You think we ought to get started? Yeah. All right. Well, let me go ahead and just give you a little bit of preliminary information here on what we're going to be talking about tonight. This is the old Spanish flu, and let me give you some background on this. Uh, 1918, the World War One is still raging throughout Europe. World War One went from 1914 until November of 1918. During the war is when the Spanish flu broke out. The Spanish flu started around January of 1918. So you've got the World War going on and all the atrocity and death and carnage from that. And on top of that, you have the Spanish flu that begins spreading, and it continues to spread until December of 1920 is when they pretty much consider it gone. In that time, from January 1918 until December 1920, 27% of the entire world's population was infected with the Spanish flu. That was around 500 million people. Okay, here, Mom's coming back, so I'm gonna. All right, everybody say goodbye to Bailey. Bye bye. All right, she's gonna go to bed for the night. Thank you. So, 500 million people. 500 million people infected with this. Can you imagine? And it resulted in the death count is a matter of debate between historians and governments. The largest consensus is that it was at minimum 20 million people who died. Up to 50 million people is what they had settled on. But in recent years, since the 90s on, they've been looking at it again and are looking at the possibility that upwards of 100 million people died from it. And a reason that more deaths weren't reported at the time is because, and we'll talk about this, is because of the World War I propaganda going on. So how did this thing get started? The most popular theory as to how Spanish flu got started is that it actually started among British soldiers, British troops in France during World War I around March of 1918. You know that World War I was, there was lots of chemical warfare, right? So they've got these triages and field hospitals set up all over the place treating people for respiratory illnesses and damage from this. Adolf Hitler at the end of World War I was blinded by one of these chemical attacks. And that's how he ended up in a hospital sitting there blind at the end of World War I. And when Germany surrendered, he was very pissed off about that and thought it was a terrible thing that they surrendered. So anyway, these field hospitals, a lot of them in France were out in the countryside. There were pig farms, there were chicken farms, and so there is some speculation based on the science and the possibility that this was a zoonotic disease that transferred from animals to humans. They think that. But that's not something that is a certainty. Honestly, we don't know for sure how the Spanish flu got started. The second most popular theory, or most common theory, that is accepted as a very real possibility is that it did not start in France. It did not even start in Europe. There were a couple of historians that have really worked on this a lot, John Barry and Alfred Crosby, who believe that it actually started not in March 1918 in Europe, in France, but actually started in January of 1918 in the United States in Kansas. And they point to, they after the war, you're able to go back and look at records that have eventually been open to the public and that you couldn't see in that time period. And in doing so, they find that there were 14 different military camps, U.S. military camps, that had some kind of very severe flu-like illness that was killing people. a large number of soldiers prior to it breaking out a few months later in Europe. So one of these two is most likely correct, either the European British soldiers or the U.S. troops. And so it kind of, when we hear in the news today, the speculation, how did this start? Why don't we know where it started? Well, it's the fog of the propaganda war. If indeed this has been used as some kind of a bioweapon or weaponized, even though it may be a totally naturally occurring virus that developed, still it can be identified, taken to various places, Iran, for example, released to try and use it as a bioweapon. So that's the case with the Spanish flu. There's a lot of speculation there that whether it started naturally or they worked on it, and either way, they think that it was definitely used in part of the war effort. And the thing hit every area of the globe. We'll read here in a little while about Alaska and the Eskimos and how it ravaged them. Another reason that we think that the numbers are not down around 20 million deaths globally is because India says that they alone, just in their country, that they had 12 to 17 million deaths, 5% of their total population at that time. China had 5 to 9 million. China was one of the least impacted of all the regions based on the relative to the size of the population. Now, this, unlike what they're saying about this coronavirus today, the Spanish flu was especially bad toward the younger people. It had a much better, a much higher fatality rate among the younger people. So, 99% of the people who died from Spanish flu were under 65 years old. Now, of course, this is a century ago, and so there was a much lower, life expectancy. But still, half of that 99% that died were ages. These were people ages 20 to 40 years old. So it really targeted younger people, and it happened in two main waves. You had the first wave, but it was actually the second wave of the Spanish flu that was much, much worse than the first one. People thought it was over. They thought it was on its way out, but then it came back, and it just started really wiping people out. And after, as a indication that this was used during the course of the war, when that second wave broke out in late 1918, or in mid-1918, it shifted the balance of power during the war. The Central Powers had the upper hand until this thing really shifted and really started taking the power away from Germany and allowing the Allied forces to eventually win the war. And then at the end of 1918, late 1918 in November, it abruptly ended. They don't know why. They don't know why it suddenly stopped. Some speculation is that it actually mutated into a less deadly strain, that it was still going around, but it didn't have the kind of mortality rate that it did earlier on. So why was it called the Spanish flu? So far you haven't heard me say anything about Spain. Really, it didn't have much to do with Spain. It was misnamed. Again, this is wartime. The reason that it came to be called the Spanish flu is because Spain was one of the few European countries, at least the major ones, that had remained neutral. They were not fighting. They were not on one side or the other. They remained neutral during World War I. And because of that, you did not have, for example, the Allied propaganda machine, the governments controlling and censoring what information is coming out about the war. Same with the Central Powers. You don't have the Germany was controlling what was being said, what was being released. So Spain was able to report on this without all of the propaganda and the censorship to control the narrative. And so here, especially, well, in the West, either from the UK on over to the United States, the only people that were really reporting a lot about this, and they were doing it in very graphic detail, was the Spanish media. And so outside nations, including the United States, took that to mean that, well, Spain, since they're the ones talking about all of these deaths, Spain must be ground zero. This must be a Spanish flu. And so that's why the United States started calling it Spanish flu and Spanish lady. And but on the other hand, in Spain, they didn't call it the Spanish flu. They called it the French flu, because they understood that this flu had originated there in the on the fields of war in France. So they called it the French flu.
If you appreciate hard-hitting investigative journalism that you won't get from the mainstream media, then please support Jake's research and analysis at patreon.com/endtimesnewsreport, paypal.me/endtimesnewsreport, or send a check or money order to Jake Morphonios, P.O. Box 1333, Kernersville, North Carolina 27285. If you appreciate hard-hitting investigative journalism that you won't get from the mainstream media, then please support Jake's research and analysis at patreon.com/endtimesnewsreport, paypal.me/endtimesnewsreport, or send a check or money order to Jake Morphonios, P.O. Box 1333, Kernersville, North Carolina 27285.